I was 27 years old when this happened, and at the time, I worked as a delivery driver in eastern West Virginia. Most of my routes were quiet and predictable, especially the ones that ran through the Appalachian backroads. That night felt no different when I started. It was just another shift, another long drive through the mountains. I had been sent to drop off supplies to a small lodge tucked deep in the hills. Tourists rarely stayed there anymore, but locals still used it for storage and seasonal work. I wasn't worried. I'd driven those roads dozens of times before. It was early evening, just before dark. The sun was dropping behind the trees, and fog was starting to settle low in the valleys. My radio kept cutting out, which was normal out there. There was no cell service, but I didn't think about it much. I remember slowing down near a sharp curve when I saw someone standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hiker or maybe a local waiting for a ride. People did that sometimes when their trucks broke down. I almost didn't stop. The man didn't wave. He didn't step forward. He just stood there, facing the trees, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I rolled past him, telling myself it wasn't my problem. But when I checked my side mirror, he had turned his head and was watching my truck disappear up the road. His face was blank. No expression at all. A few minutes later, I noticed something odd. The same stretch of road felt longer than it should have been. The curves didn't match what I remembered. The lodge should have been closer by then. Then my headlights caught movement ahead. Another figure stood in the road, almost in the same spot as the first man. Same posture. Same stillness. That's when my stomach tightened. I slowed down again, confused, trying to make sense of it. This man slowly lifted his head and looked straight at me. It was the same face. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I had turned around without realizing it. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. But as I passed him, I noticed something that made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. His boots were covered in dried mud. Fresh mud, like he'd been standing in the woods for a long time. And then I saw footprints in the dirt road ahead. They were leading away from the trees, straight toward where my truck would stop. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a normal delivery anymore. And whatever was waiting for me up that road already knew I was coming. I had been working that delivery job for almost 2 years by then. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. Most of my routes ran through small towns and rural areas across Appalachia. People out there depended on deliveries, especially places far from the main highways. The lodge I was headed to sat several miles off the nearest paved road. It used to be popular with tourists years ago, before newer resorts were built closer to town. Now it mostly served as a storage site for equipment and supplies. A caretaker stayed there during the warmer months, but I was told he might not be around that evening. It was late fall, the kind of time when the mountains start to feel empty. The trees were almost bare, and the air had that cold, damp smell that comes before winter. Fog rolled in early that night, settling low along the road and between the hills. My headlights cut through it in narrow beams. I was supposed to drop the boxes at the back entrance and leave them by the loading door.
No signatures.
No face-to-face contact. That was normal for after-hours deliveries. I expected to be there less than 5 minutes. The road leading to the lodge was narrow and uneven. There were no streetlights, only wooden signs nailed to trees, some so old the lettering had faded. Every few miles, I passed a closed gate or a long dirt path disappearing into the woods. Places like that always looked abandoned, even when they weren't. I was alone in the truck, just me and the hum of the engine. The radio kept losing signal, switching between static and faint music from distant stations. I turned it off to focus on the road. The silence felt heavier after that. I didn't know anyone at the lodge personally. The only name I had was the caretaker's first name, Earl, written on the delivery slip. I had never met him before. I assumed he would either be asleep or not there at all. As I drove deeper into the mountains, the road signs became less frequent. My GPS stopped updating, frozen on a single curve I had passed minutes earlier. That happened sometimes out there, so I ignored it. I trusted my memory more than the screen. By the time I reached the final stretch of road, the sky was fully dark. The fog was thicker now, clinging to the ground and drifting slowly across the path ahead. I told myself I'd be done soon and back on the main road before it got any worse. At that point, everything still felt normal. Uncomfortable, maybe, but normal. I had no reason to think this delivery would be any different from the dozens I had done before. I didn't know then that someone else had already noticed my truck, or that my arrival was not a surprise to them at all. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything had become. When I turned off the main road and onto the final dirt path leading to the lodge, even the insects seemed to disappear.
No crickets.
No wind in the trees. Just the sound of my tires crunching over gravel. The fog grew thicker as I drove, clinging to the ground and crawling across the road in slow waves. My headlights felt weaker, like they were being swallowed by the darkness ahead. I slowed down, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't see far enough to feel comfortable. That's when I heard a noise outside the truck. At first, it sounded like something brushing against the side panel. I told myself it was just low branches or brush growing too close to the road. But the sound followed me, staying at the same pace as the truck for several seconds. I glanced at my side mirror. All I could see was fog and darkness. Nothing moved. A few moments later, the noise stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I became aware of my own breathing, slow and steady, filling the cab. As I rounded another curve, my headlights caught something on the edge of the road. A wooden post stood there, leaning slightly, with a piece of cloth tied around it. It looked like a marker of some kind. I didn't remember seeing it on previous trips. The cloth moved gently, even though there was no wind. I watched it in my mirror until it disappeared into the fog. A minute later, I saw movement deeper in the trees. It was subtle, just a shift of darkness between the trunks. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a stray dog. Animals were common out there. Still, I found myself checking my mirrors more often. I rolled my window down slightly, hoping to hear something that would explain it. Instead, I heard what sounded like footsteps on leaves.
Slow.
Careful. They stopped when I stopped listening. I reached the small clearing where the lodge should have come into view. The building was there, but only part of it was visible through the fog. One light glowed faintly from a side window. The rest of the place was dark. I pulled into the gravel lot and turned off the engine. The sudden silence made my ears ring. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, telling myself to finish the delivery and leave. Then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt beside mine. They were deep, like a heavy vehicle had been parked there recently. I hadn't passed another car on the road in over an hour. I reached for the door handle, then paused. From somewhere near the back of the lodge, I heard a low sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded like someone slowly dragging their feet across gravel. That was when the feeling fully set in. I was not alone out there. I stayed inside the truck longer than I should have. My hand rested on the door handle, but I didn't open it. The sound near the back of the lodge stopped, like whoever made it knew I was listening. I turned the key slightly, ready to start the engine again if I had to. The headlights washed over the front of the building. Nothing moved. The fog made the lodge look cut off from the rest of the world. I finally stepped out, keeping the driver's door open behind me. The cold air hit my face, sharp and damp. I grabbed one of the boxes from the back of the truck and started walking toward the loading door. Halfway there, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer. They weren't rushed. They matched my pace, stopping when I stopped. I stood still, holding the box against my chest, listening. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small in the open space. No answer. The light in the side window flickered. For a second, a shadow passed behind the glass. Too tall to be an animal. Too slow to be my imagination. I took another step forward. Gravel shifted somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel someone there, close enough that if I moved wrong, they'd reach me. The loading door was only a few feet away now. I set the box down harder than I meant to and reached for the handle. It didn't move.
Locked.
That's when panic started to creep in. I wasn't supposed to need a key. I tried again, pulling harder this time. Nothing. Behind me, I heard breathing. Slow. Steady. close enough that it didn't echo. I turned around. A man stood near the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see his outline.
Tall.
Broad shoulders.
He didn't speak.
I backed toward the truck without taking my eyes off him. He stepped forward when I did, always keeping the same distance. The driver's door was still open. That gave me a little hope. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Another shape moved near the trees on the far side of the lot. Lower to the ground, but just as still. I wasn't dealing with one person. My phone buzzed in my pocket. No service. Just the screen lighting up and going dark again. The man in front of me took another step closer. This time, I could see his hands. They were dirty, covered in dried mud. I smelled something sharp and sour in the air.
Sweat.
Old clothes. I tightened my grip on the keys and kept backing up. My foot hit something solid. The truck wasn't behind me anymore. I had backed into the side of the lodge. That's when I realized how boxed in I really was. The man stepped out of the fog without warning. He was closer than I expected, close enough that I could see his face, clearly now. His eyes were wide and fixed on me, unblinking. His mouth hung slightly open, like he was breathing through it on purpose. "Don't move," he said. His voice was calm, almost tired. I didn't answer. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I shifted my weight, looking for a way around him. But the wall of the lodge was tight against my back. He raised one hand slowly. Something dark and metal glinted between his fingers. A knife. The blade caught the headlights as he moved. I turned and ran. I didn't think about where I was going. I just moved. My boots slipped on the gravel as I ran along the side of the building, keeping one hand on the wall so I wouldn't lose my balance. I heard him behind me. Not shouting. Not running hard. Just fast enough to let me know he was there. I rounded the corner and slammed into the back of the lodge. There was a narrow storage area with stacked crates and old equipment. I ducked between them and dropped to my knees, pressing myself into the darkest corner. My phone slipped from my hand and hit the ground. The screen lit up. I froze. Footsteps approached. Slow. Deliberate. Gravel crunching with each step. The light from a flashlight swept across the wall. It passed over the crates, then came back. Closer this time. I covered my mouth to keep my breathing quiet. My chest burned. The beam stopped just inches from my face. For a moment, everything was still. Then another voice spoke from the other side of the building. "Found him yet?" My stomach dropped. The man near me answered quietly, almost. I moved without thinking. I kicked one of the crates as hard as I could and bolted in the opposite direction. The noise bought me a second. I sprinted toward the truck, jumping over loose equipment and broken boards. Hands grabbed at my jacket and missed. I dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The engine struggled before turning over. The man hit the side of the truck hard, slapping the window with the flat of his hand. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt. As I pulled away, I saw him standing in the headlights. He wasn't angry. He wasn't chasing. He was smiling. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to pull over just to breathe. I called 911 the moment I got a signal and tried to explain what happened, but the words came out messy and rushed. They told me to stay where I was. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 15 minutes later. They listened carefully, asked me to repeat everything, and then followed me back toward the lodge. By the time we reached the dirt road again, the fog had thinned slightly. The place looked different in the flashing lights. Smaller. Less mysterious. The men were gone. The deputies searched the area with flashlights. They found fresh footprints in the gravel. More than one set. They led behind the lodge and into the woods, then disappeared among the leaves. That's when one of the deputies noticed something near the loading door. A padlock lay broken on the ground. The door wasn't locked from the inside like I thought. It had been locked from the outside. Inside the lodge, they found more signs. Sleeping bags in a storage room. Empty food cans. Water bottles lined up neatly near a wall. Someone had been using the lodge regularly. Then the deputy asked me a question that made my chest tighten. He asked if I had spoken to the caretaker before arriving. I told him no. I had never met Earl. The deputy nodded slowly. He said Earl hadn't worked there in over 6 months. They took me to the station to give a formal statement. That's where the real shock came. One of the deputies pulled out a folder and showed me a photo. It was grainy, taken from a gas station camera in a nearby county. 2 men stood near a truck, both wearing heavy jackets. I recognized the face immediately. The man from the fog. The deputy told me they had been looking for him for weeks. Not for robbery. Not for assault. For luring delivery drivers. The men would watch access roads and listen for engines. They memorized schedules. They used abandoned buildings to wait. Sometimes they would block exits. Sometimes they would pretend to be caretakers. One driver had disappeared a month earlier. His truck was found empty, parked off a service road. No body.
No arrests.
That's when the deputy said something I still think about. He told me the men never chased their victims far. They relied on panic. On mistakes. They didn't need to catch everyone. Just one. I realized then why the man smiled when I escaped. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He had already done this before. I didn't go back to work for a long time after that night. The company reassigned my route, and eventually I quit altogether. No one blamed me. They acted like I was lucky. The deputies kept in touch for a few weeks. They asked if I remembered any new details. If I had noticed accents, tattoos, scars. I didn't have much to give them. They never caught the men. A month later, I got a call from one of the deputies. He told me the lodge had been cleared out and boarded up. All the doors were sealed. Warning signs were posted along the road. I thought that would make me feel better. It didn't, because a few days after that call, I received an email from my old supervisor. He wanted to know if I had ever made it to the lodge that night. I told him yes. I told him everything had been reported. He replied with one short sentence. He said the delivery had been marked as completed in the system. I hadn't marked it that way. I tried to explain it must have been a mistake. He said it wasn't. The timestamp showed the update happened while I was still driving away from the lodge. Someone had access to my route information, my schedule, my stop history. After that, small things started bothering me. A truck idling too long behind me at a stoplight. Footsteps that slowed when I slowed. Shadows that didn't line up right. Once, weeks later, I found muddy boot prints behind my apartment building. They stopped just beneath my window. I called the police. They searched the area and found nothing. The case with the missing driver is still open. No suspects named. No arrests made. Sometimes late at night I think about the way that man looked at me. Not angry. Not rushed. Like he had all the time in the world. And every now and then, when I check my phone, I notice something that makes my stomach tighten. A delivery route notification. A place I don't recognize. Deep in the Appalachian hills. I don't know who sent it.
I don't know why.
I just know that somewhere out there someone is still watching the roads. I try to go back to a normal routine after that, but it never really worked. I moved apartments within the same city, then moved again a few months later. Each place felt temporary, like I was just passing through. I stopped telling people where I worked or what my schedule was. The deputies checked in less and less. Eventually, the calls stopped. When I reached out, I was told the investigation was still open, but there were no updates. That phrase started to feel meaningless. Life around me kept moving. People talked about work, plans, vacations. I nodded along and acted normal. But every quiet moment brought my mind back to that road. What bothered me most wasn't the knife or the chase. It was how organized everything felt. The timing. The way they knew where I would be and when. I started noticing patterns everywhere. Cars slowing down when I slowed down. The same pickup parked near my building more than once. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then something happened that made it harder to ignore. One evening, I stopped at a grocery store on the edge of town. It was nearly empty. As I walked back to my car, I noticed muddy footprints near the driver's side door. They were fresh. I stood there for a long moment, keys in my hand, listening. Nothing moved.
No voices. No footsteps.
I checked under the car. Nothing. I drove home with my mirrors adjusted wider than usual. A few weeks later, I requested a copy of my police report for my own records. While reading through it, I noticed a detail I had missed before. One of the deputies had written that the men were believed to use radios to communicate. Short range, hard to track. That explained the second voice. What it didn't explain was how quiet they were, how practiced. Late one night, I searched online for the missing driver mentioned in the report. There wasn't much. A short local article. A photo of his truck. The comments were turned off. Someone had replied to the article months later with a single sentence. It said, "He went where he wasn't supposed to." The account name was deleted. I still avoid mountain roads whenever I can. I don't hike. I don't camp. I don't take shortcuts through rural areas, no matter how much time they save. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I catch myself checking the fog along the roadside, looking for shapes that don't move, listening for footsteps that match my pace. I never found out what happened to the missing driver. No body was ever recovered. No suspects were named publicly. What stays with me is the thought that those men didn't need the lodge. They didn't need that road. They just needed someone predictable. Someone who believed they were alone. And every time I pass a delivery truck on the highway heading toward the mountains, I wonder if the driver knows what kind of places still exist out there. Places that don't show up on maps anymore. Places where people watch.
And wait.